There is something unsettling about the earliest written records of humanity. Not because they are primitive, not because they are symbolic, but because they speak with a confidence that does not sound like myth. The oldest tablets we have do not ask who we are. They explain it. And what they explain does not align with the story we tell ourselves today. According to these records, humanity did not slowly rise into civilization through chance and gradual discovery. Instead, civilization appears suddenly, already organized, already structured, already constrained. That contradiction has never been fully resolved. The Sumerians, who left behind the earliest known writing system, did not describe themselves as inventors of their world. They described themselves as inheritors. This is where the discomfort begins, because inheritance implies prior ownership. The tablets speak of a time before kings, before cities, before law, a time when the world was already divided, managed, and supervised, not by humans. Ancient texts referred to beings they called the Anunnaki, a term often translated cautiously as those of royal blood, or those who came from above. Scholars debate whether this language is symbolic, political, or theological. But what cannot be ignored is how consistently these beings are described not as abstract gods, but as administrators. They assign roles. They enforce labor. They regulate reproduction. They intervene when systems become unstable. This is not how mythology usually behaves. Most creation myths elevate humanity. These texts diminish it. Humans are not described as chosen. They are described as necessary. The tablets repeatedly frame humanity as a solution to a problem. That problem, according to the texts, was labor. Some passages describe a time when the world was already operational, but those maintaining it had grown unwilling to continue their work. This is where interpretation becomes delicate. Responsible scholarship requires caution. Many historians argue these accounts reflect social memory, stories shaped by human labor struggles, projected onto divine figures. That explanation is possible, but it does not explain why the language is so procedural. The tablets do not describe suffering poetically. They describe workloads. They do not describe rebellion morally. They describe it administratively. And they do not describe creation magically. They describe it methodically. In several texts, humans are said to have been fashioned, not born, not evolved, fashioned. The wording implies assembly rather than emergence. Scholars often translate this as metaphor, yet even as metaphor, the implication is striking. Humanity exists because something else required it. This is not a flattering origin story, and that is precisely why it demands attention. Civilizations rarely invent stories that portray themselves as subordinate, unless those stories serve a deeper truth or a deeper warning. The tablets describe early humans as limited, short-lived, narrowly focused, dependent. They are not condemned for this. It is presented as design. Some researchers suggest this reflects ancient attempts to explain mortality. Others propose it encodes memory of real biological constraints. Either way, the result is the same. Human beings are framed as workers within a larger system they did not create, and that system appears planetary in scale. The Earth is not described as a wilderness to be conquered. It is described as a managed environment. Boundaries exist. Zones are assigned. Certain regions are restricted. Certain activities are permitted. Others are forbidden. In later interpretations, this structure becomes moral law. But in its earliest form, it reads more like regulation. What unsettles many readers is not the idea of gods. It is the idea of oversight. The texts suggest that humanity's earliest role was not exploration or self-expression. It was maintenance, keeping something running. And when that maintenance became inefficient or unstable, intervention followed. Sometimes corrective, sometimes destructive. Flood narratives appear here, not as punishment for sin, but as system resets. This distinction matters. A moral flood condemns. A reset corrects. Several ancient cultures describe catastrophic floods, but the Sumerian versions are unusually procedural. Warnings are issued. Parameters are set. Survivors are selected not for virtue, but for utility. Preservation of genetic diversity is emphasized, not redemption. Scholars debate how literally to read this, but even as allegory, the logic remains mechanical, which raises an uncomfortable question. If these texts reflect how ancient people understood their world, why does that understanding resemble modern system theory more than mythology? Why does it sound less like worship and more like documentation? And perhaps more importantly, why does humanity in these stories never occupy the highest position? Instead, humans exist between earth and sky, between creation and control, between autonomy and dependence. Later civilizations soften this framing. They elevate humans. They reinterpret service as devotion. They recast obedience as faith. But the oldest texts do not bother. They simply state the hierarchy. At the top, those who oversee. Below, those who serve. And somewhere within that structure, humanity learns to build, govern, and replicate the system itself. This is where the idea of a planet-sized prison begins. Not as a cage, but as a condition. A world that functions. A world that sustains life. A world that limits movement, lifespan, and awareness. Not through force, through design. Whether this design was intentional, symbolic, or misunderstood remains debated. But the pattern persists. Humans build civilizations that mirror the same structure. Elites at the top, labor at the base. Rules that preserve stability over freedom. Systems that endure even when their purpose is forgotten. And this raises the question that quietly echoes beneath every line of these ancient tablets. If humanity was created or conditioned to serve, who exactly was being served? And more importantly, is that service truly over? The question lingers, not because it demands belief, but because it refuses to disappear. If the earliest records describe humanity as part of a system, then the next question is not who created the system, but how deeply it shaped those living inside it. The Sumerian tablets do not describe chains or walls. They describe order. And order, when inherited rather than chosen, can be more binding than force. In these texts, the world is already divided long before humans begin to rule it. Sky, earth, waters, underworld, each has jurisdiction, each has authority, each has limits. Humans do not cross these boundaries freely. They are placed. This placement is subtle in the language, but persistent. Cities are founded not where humans wish to build, but where instruction indicates stability. Kings rule not by personal right, but by mandate. Granted, withdrawn, reassigned. Even knowledge itself is regulated. Some texts speak of wisdom being given in measured portions. Too much awareness, the stories imply, destabilizes balance. This idea appears again and again across early cultures, but the Sumerian version is unusually explicit. Humanity is not meant to know everything, not because knowledge is evil, but because it alters function. From a modern perspective, this resembles a safety protocol. Limit access, prevent system overload, maintain equilibrium. Scholars are careful here, and rightly so. Many argue this language reflects early social hierarchy, priests and rulers controlling knowledge to preserve power. That explanation fits part of the pattern, but it does not explain why the same limitation is attributed to non-human authorities in the earliest layers of text. Before kings claimed divine sanction, the divine already limited human capacity. The sequence matters. The tablet suggests that before humanity governed itself, it was governed. Not tyrannically, methodically. And governance leaves traces. One of the most curious aspects of these records is how little they celebrate human achievement. Writing is not praised as invention. Agriculture is not framed as discovery. Cities are not described as triumphs. They are described as implementations. The language implies that systems already existed, and humans learned to operate them. This is where the idea of a planetary framework gains weight. If the Earth was viewed as an environment already structured, then humanity's role becomes clearer. Humans are adapters. They inherit processes they did not design. They maintain cycles they do not fully understand. And over time, maintenance becomes tradition. Tradition becomes belief. Belief becomes identity. The original function fades, but the structure remains. This is not unique to Sumer, but Sumer records it first. The Anunnaki, whatever their true nature, symbolic, mythic, or misunderstood, are not presented as creators obsessed with worship. They are managers concerned with output. Labor must be completed. Resources must flow. Disruptions must be corrected. Humanity fits into this equation neatly. Short-lived, enough to prevent accumulation of dangerous insight. Adaptive enough to respond to environmental shifts. Social enough to self-regulate through hierarchy. From this perspective, the concept of a prison changes shape. A prison does not require bars if behavior is aligned with expectation. The Sumerian texts do not describe humans trying to escape the world. They describe humans trying to make sense of their role within it. The question of freedom does not arise, only duty. And duty is most effective when it feels natural. One of the most debated passages in Sumerian literature describes the moment when humans are completed. Not perfected, completed. The term implies adequacy, not excellence. Humans are sufficient for their purpose. No more, no less. This language troubles modern readers because it clashes with the narrative of progress. We prefer to believe humanity is always becoming something greater. The tablets suggest humanity was made to fit something specific, and once that fit was achieved, the process stopped. Evolution in these stories is not endless. It is constrained. Again, scholars urge caution. Much of this language may be poetic. Much may be symbolic. But symbolism still reflects worldview, and the worldview preserved here is one of limitation by design. What is striking is how rarely these texts express rebellion. When conflict appears, it is not humanity rising against overseers. It is overseers debating among themselves. Humans are not the protagonists of cosmic drama. They are the workforce. This absence of rebellion is telling. Either the system was accepted, or resistance was unimaginable. Over time, the presence of the Anunnaki fades. Later texts speak less of direct oversight and more of legacy. Rituals replace instructions. Myths replace procedures. The system continues, but its origin is obscured. At this stage, something subtle happens. Humans begin to rule themselves using the same structures once imposed upon them. Kings mirror overseers. Temples mirror administrative centers. Laws mirror constraints. The hierarchy persists even when the original authority withdraws. This is the most important transition. The system no longer needs its architects. It has been internalized. From this moment on, humanity becomes both inhabitant and warden. The planet-sized prison, if it exists at all, no longer requires supervision. Its occupants maintain it willingly. This raises a question that feels philosophical, but is grounded in historical pattern. If a system continues after its creators are gone, does it remain a prison? Or does it become culture? The Sumerians did not answer this directly. They simply recorded what they observed. A world shaped before memory, a role assigned before identity, a system inherited before choice, and humanity learning to live inside it. What they leave us with is not accusation, it is implication. If humanity was built to serve a function, and if that function shaped civilization itself, then the question is no longer about ancient gods. It is about continuity. Are we still serving something we no longer recognize? Or did the system dissolve so completely that only its shadow remains? The tablets fall silent before answering. They do not describe an end. They describe a handover. And that handover, quiet and unremarked, may be the most consequential moment of all. Because from that point forward, there is no overseer to blame, only inheritance, and the choices made within it. Once the handover is complete, the tone of the record changes. The language becomes less precise, less procedural, more symbolic. This shift is subtle, but it matters. Earlier tablets read like logs, measured, intentional, focused on function. Later ones read like memory, filtered, interpreted, reshaped by time. This is often where modern readers assume myth begins, but myth does not appear suddenly. It grows where clarity fades. The Sumerians did not record the departure of overseers as an event. There is no final proclamation, no closing ritual. Oversight simply recedes. Instructions become traditions. Schedules become calendars. Rules become laws. And in that quiet transition, humanity begins to narrate itself differently. Kings now claim descent rather than assignment. Priests interpret will rather than receive orders. The system is no longer maintained because it must be. It is maintained because it has always been so. This is how inherited frameworks survive. Not through enforcement, but through normalization. At this stage, the idea of a planetary structure becomes more difficult to identify, precisely because it is no longer explicit. Yet traces remain. Boundaries are still enforced, now called sacred. Certain lands remain forbidden. Certain knowledge remains restricted. The justification shifts, but the behavior persists. Scholars often explain this as social consolidation. Early elites preserving authority through cosmology. That explanation accounts for power. It does not fully explain consistency. Why do civilizations separated by geography retain similar structural patterns? Why do early societies independently develop hierarchical labor systems, sacred geographies, and knowledge restrictions? The answer may not be singular, but the Sumerian tablets offer a framework that later cultures echo without remembering its source. A world already divided, roles already assigned, limits already understood. Humans are born into this arrangement and rarely question its origin. One of the most curious omissions in the Sumerian record is any sustained speculation about escape. Not escape from tyranny, but escape from the world itself. The sky is not framed as a frontier. The sea is not a boundary to cross indefinitely. The underworld is not a destination to reach. All realms exist, but movement between them is controlled. Even gods require permission. This containment is rarely discussed explicitly, but it permeates the cosmology. The universe is not infinite. It is compartmentalized, and humanity occupies a defined zone within it. Modern readers often interpret this as ancient cosmology, a limited understanding of space. But the language of limitation is moral as well as spatial. Humans are told what is not for them. Certain powers, certain insights, certain thresholds. When boundaries are crossed in myth, the consequence is not punishment for disobedience. It is destabilization, floods, plagues, collapse. These are not framed as vengeance. They are framed as imbalance. This distinction is critical. A prison punishes transgression. A system corrects instability. The Sumerian worldview leans toward the latter, which complicates the metaphor. If humanity lived within a planetary system designed for stability, then the question is not whether it was oppressive. The question is whether it was sustainable. The tablets repeatedly emphasize cycles: creation followed by correction, growth followed by reduction, expansion followed by reset. Humans are part of these cycles, not masters of them. What unsettles modern sensibilities is the implication that progress has limits, not moral limits, structural ones. The Sumerians did not imagine infinite growth. They imagined balance. And balance, once exceeded, demanded intervention. This worldview persists, even after oversight fades. Civilizations rise confidently, then suddenly contract, often without clear external cause. Archaeology records these moments as collapse. The texts frame them as return, not to chaos, but to baseline. When populations grow too large, resources strain. When authority fragments, systems destabilize. When knowledge proliferates without restraint, cohesion fractures. These are not moral judgments, they are observations. The planet-sized prison metaphor gains traction here not as a literal enclosure, but as a bounded environment with tolerances. Humans can innovate, but only within certain limits. When those limits are breached, the system responds, sometimes gently, sometimes catastrophically. The Sumerians do not describe this as malevolent. They describe it as inevitable. This inevitability removes blame. No one is at fault when the flood comes. It is simply time. This is profoundly different from later religious narratives that moralize disaster. Here, disaster is logistical, a reset to preserve long-term function. This perspective reframes the role of humanity again. Not prisoners, not slaves, but components. Necessary, valuable, and replaceable. This is the most uncomfortable implication. Components are maintained only as long as they perform their role. Once they destabilize the system, they are adjusted or removed. The tablets do not dwell on this. They state it plainly, which raises the quietest, most enduring question of all. If humanity once understood itself as a component in a larger system, when did it begin to believe it was the system itself? That transition may be the most consequential moment in human history. Because once humans claim authorship, the feedback mechanisms change. Correction is no longer accepted as necessary. It is resisted as injustice. Limits are no longer understood as stabilizing. They are framed as oppression. The system still exists, but awareness of it fades. And when awareness fades, misalignment grows. This may explain why later civilizations experience collapse as tragedy rather than correction. They no longer recognize the cycle. They expect permanence. The Sumerians did not. They expected return. This expectation shaped everything. Architecture, designed to endure floods. Calendars aligned to celestial cycles. Rituals intended to restore balance. Even kings were temporary. Their legitimacy expired. Power was not absolute. It was conditional. These conditions mirror the logic of a system more than the will of a deity. Which brings us back to the central unease. If the earliest records describe humanity as designed to fit a system, and later cultures inherit the system without understanding its origin, then the question is not whether we are still being watched. It is whether we are still being corrected. The absence of overseers does not mean the absence of limits. It may simply mean the system is now self-regulating. Climate, ecology, population dynamics. These modern terms describe process the Sumerians encoded mythically. Different language, same patterns. This does not require belief in ancient gods. It requires attention to structure. And structure, once recognized, cannot be unseen. The tablets never say the system ends. They say it endures. Quietly, indifferently, patiently. Which suggests that the most dangerous moment is not when the system asserts itself. It is when humanity forgets it exists at all, because forgetting removes restraint. And restraint, in these texts, is the thin line between stability and collapse. The Sumerians did not frame this as doom. They framed it as reminder. They wrote not to warn, but to preserve understanding, so that when cycles repeated, someone might recognize them. Whether that recognition still occurs is not a question the tablets answer. They leave it open. And in doing so, they leave it with us. There is a moment in every long-running system when memory becomes more dangerous than ignorance. The Sumerian tablets seem aware of this. They do not attempt to preserve every detail. They do not insist on perfect continuity. Instead, they leave fragments, enough to recognize a pattern, but not enough to control it. This restraint is unusual. Most cultures strive to immortalize themselves. They carve monuments. They glorify rulers. They exaggerate victories. The earliest Sumerian records do something quieter. They document conditions, not ideals, not aspirations, conditions, water levels, crop cycles, labor divisions, celestial movements. Even their myths read like system notes, stories designed to encode behavior rather than inspire devotion. This suggests a civilization that understood impermanence not as failure, but as function. The idea that civilizations are temporary does not disturb the Sumerians. What disturbs them is imbalance. And imbalance, in their worldview, does not originate from malice. It originates from forgetting boundaries. One tablet, often cited but rarely emphasized, describes a period when humans multiplied beyond measure. The phrase is easy to overlook. It does not accuse. It does not moralize. It simply states that growth exceeded expectation. Soon after, intervention follows. Later traditions interpret this as punishment. The Sumerian framing is more neutral. The system adjusted. This language mirrors modern ecological thinking with unsettling accuracy. Systems tolerate variation. They correct excess. Whether through scarcity, migration, or collapse, balance is restored. The implication is not that humanity is controlled by unseen jailers. It is that humanity exists within constraints that do not negotiate. A prison has guards. A system has thresholds. The tablets never describe fear of the Anunnaki. They describe respect for process, which raises an important distinction. If humanity was built, or shaped, to serve, service may not have meant obedience to beings. It may have meant participation in maintenance, keeping the world running, ensuring continuity, preventing collapse through adherence to limits. Seen this way, the planet-sized prison metaphor dissolves. What remains is something more subtle, a contract, not written, not chosen, but inherited. Humanity lives inside a world that works only if certain balances are preserved. Those balances existed before writing, before memory, before identity. The Sumerians did not claim to invent them. They claimed to observe them. This observation shaped their governance. Kings were not absolute rulers. They were caretakers. Their authority depended on alignment, with seasons, with gods, with the land. When alignment failed, kings were removed, sometimes violently, sometimes ritually. This too reflects system logic, rather than moral judgment. Failure was not evil, it was dysfunction. As time passed, this logic softened. Later civilizations inherited the forms without the reasoning. Kings became divine rather than conditional. Law became rigid rather than adaptive. Growth became virtue rather than risk. And collapse followed, again and again. Archaeology confirms this pattern. Sudden, urban abandonment, population decline, loss of writing, regression of technology. We label these dark ages. The Sumerians might have labeled them resets. This framing does not comfort modern sensibilities. We prefer narratives of progress. But progress assumes direction. The tablets imply recurrence. A cycle that does not care about aspiration, only balance. This is where the idea of humanity serving something larger becomes unavoidable. Not serving beings, serving continuity, serving equilibrium, serving the long survival of a system that predates us. The unsettling thought is not that humans were created to serve. It is that we still are. Not by command, by necessity. If humanity consumes too much, imbalance follows. If it fragments beyond cohesion, stability emerges. If it alters the environment faster than adaptation allows, correction occurs. These are not punishments. They are responses. The Sumerians encoded this understanding into myth because myth endures longer than instruction. They trusted future generations to interpret. Whether we have interpreted correctly is uncertain, but the patterns remain. Civilizations that ignore limits fall. Those that respect cycles endure longer. The overseers, if they ever existed, are no longer required. The system enforces itself. This may be the most profound inheritance of all. A world that does not need rulers, only awareness. The tablets do not demand belief. They invite recognition. They ask the reader to notice structure where chaos is assumed, to see order where randomness is blamed, and to understand that survival is not about dominance. It is about alignment. Whether humanity can remember this without external guidance is the unanswered question that lingers beyond the final line of clay. The Sumerians stopped writing before answering it, perhaps because they believed the answer could only be lived, not recorded. If the system endures without its architects, then memory becomes the final variable. The Sumerians seem to understand this intuitively. Their records do not insist on permanence of knowledge. They anticipate loss. In several texts, knowledge is described as something that returns rather than progresses. Wisdom is not cumulative. It cycles. This idea stands in direct contrast to modern assumptions. We believe knowledge stacks, that each generation builds upon the last. The Sumerian worldview is quieter. It suggests that knowledge survives only when conditions allow it to be used responsibly. When conditions change, knowledge retreats. This retreat is not framed as tragedy. It is framed as protection. Too much knowledge in the wrong context destabilizes balance. This is why certain instructions are hidden within ritual, why measurements are disguised as myth, why cosmology is woven into story. Not to obscure truth forever, but to delay its misuse. The planet-sized prison metaphor, viewed through this lens, becomes something else entirely. Not confinement, containment. A controlled environment where forces larger than humanity can coexist with it. The sky is not unreachable. It is regulated. The deep earth is not forbidden. It is sealed. The sea is not endless. It has edges. These are not metaphors of fear. They are metaphors of design. The Sumerians saw the world as a machine that could be damaged, and humanity, newly introduced into that machine, had to be limited. Not because it was inferior, but because it was powerful in ways it did not yet understand. This reframes the role of the Anunnaki once more. If they existed as literal beings, they functioned less like gods and more like engineers. If they existed as symbolic representations, they encoded systemic awareness. Either way, their disappearance does not remove the system. It removes supervision. From that moment onward, humanity becomes responsible for outcomes it does not fully comprehend. This is where anxiety enters the record. Later texts express unease. Floods are remembered not just as events, but as warnings. Cities are rebuilt smaller. Walls are reinforced. Calendars become more precise. These are not acts of worship. They are acts of caution. Civilization, at this stage, is no longer confident. It is careful. The system still responds. Rivers still flood. Droughts still arrive. But now there is no intermediary. No instruction. Only observation. Humanity learns by consequence. And consequence, unlike command, leaves scars. Over generations, scars become stories. Stories become myths. Myths become belief. And belief replaces understanding. This is how systems outlive their designers. Not through clarity, but through tradition. At some point, humanity stops asking why limits exist. Limits become sacred. Breaking them becomes sin. Correction becomes judgment. This moralization is not present in the earliest tablets. It emerges later, which suggests something important. Morality fills the space left by lost instruction. When cause and effect are no longer understood, meaning is imposed. This may explain why later religions emphasize obedience. Without understanding structure, obedience is the safest substitute. But obedience does not guarantee alignment. It only delays deviation. The Sumerians never equated obedience with stability. They equated awareness with balance. This distinction is subtle, and it is easy to miss. But it may explain why civilizations that prioritize rigid belief over adaptive understanding collapse more violently. They resist correction. They deny limits. They assume permanence. The system does not. The planet-sized prison, if it exists, has no walls. It has tolerances. Cross them slowly, and the system adjusts quietly. Cross them rapidly, and adjustment feels catastrophic. The tablets do not predict a disaster. They describe response. And response is always proportional. Which brings the question closer to the present. If humanity inherited a system designed for balance, and if that system now operates without supervision, then awareness becomes the final safeguard. Not belief, not dominance. Awareness. The Sumerians wrote for those who would notice patterns, not for those seeking reassurance. Their texts are not comforting. They are clarifying. They do not ask us to fear ancient beings. They ask us to observe ourselves, to see how often we repeat the same mistakes, how often we exceed limits without understanding consequence, how often we assume control where there is only participation. This is why the tablets remain unsettling, not because they suggest humanity was built to serve something else, but because they suggest humanity still serves something larger. whether it acknowledges it or not, and service, when misunderstood, becomes exploitation, but when understood, becomes stewardship. The difference lies in awareness. The Sumerians leave us here deliberately. They do not instruct. They imply. They trust the listener to recognize the pattern, and in that trust, they pass the final responsibility forward. There is a quiet shift that happens when stewardship replaces obedience. It is subtle enough that most civilizations never notice it in real time. The Sumerians hint at this shift without naming it directly. They describe a moment when rituals remain, but intent weakens. When calendars are kept, but alignment drifts. When temples stand, but understanding thins. This is not collapse. It is drift. And drift is more dangerous than destruction, because it feels like stability. In the tablets, this phase is marked by confidence. Cities expand. Trade networks widen. Writing becomes more decorative than precise. The system appears to be working, which is exactly why correction is delayed. The Sumerians seem aware of this illusion. They do not equate prosperity with balance. They do not confuse growth with harmony. Instead, they watch for subtler signals. Seasonal irregularities, unexpected migrations, unexplained shortages. These are not interpreted as omens of punishment. They are treated as feedback. The world is communicating. And communication, once ignored, becomes louder. This is where later readers often misunderstand the texts. They expect prophecy. What they find instead is pattern recognition. The tablets do not predict specific events. They outline conditions under which certain outcomes become inevitable. If population exceeds capacity, stress follows. If resource extraction accelerates, depletion responds. If authority centralizes beyond adaptability, fracture occurs. These are not divine threats, they are systemic consequences. The Sumerians encode them mythically because myth travels further than data. But the logic underneath remains intact. This logic reframes the idea of humanity being built to serve one final time. Service does not imply submission to beings. It implies participation in continuity. Humans are positioned as caretakers not because they are favored, but because they are capable. Capable of observation. Capable of adaptation. Capable of restraint. But only if awareness is preserved. When awareness fades, capability becomes liability. The system does not punish, it compensates. And compensation often feels like loss. Flood narratives resurface here, not as memories of one event, but as recurring mechanisms. Water resets land use. Disease resets population density. Migration redistributes pressure. Each reset restores equilibrium temporarily, until growth resumes. The cycle repeats. The Sumerians do not claim this cycle can be escaped. They suggest it can be navigated. Navigation requires humility, and humility is difficult for civilizations at their peak. This may be why the tablets stop short of instruction. They know advice given to the powerful is rarely followed. Instead, they preserve observation. They record what happens when limits are ignored. They trust that future readers will recognize themselves in the pattern. This trust is unsettling. It assumes repetition. It assumes that awareness will always arrive late, which leads to the final tension the tablets leave unresolved. If humanity has always existed inside a system with limits, and if that system no longer needs overseers, then collapse is not failure. It is communication. The world adjusting to restore balance. This does not absolve humanity of responsibility. It deepens it. Because without external authority, there is no one else to blame. No gods to appease. No overseers to negotiate with. Only consequences. The Sumerians understood this transition. They lived near the edge of memory, close enough to recall instruction, far enough to feel its absence. Their writings are not warnings, they are mirrors. They reflect a moment when humanity stood between guidance and autonomy, between service and stewardship, between participation and dominance. What follows from that moment is not fate, it is choice. But choice constrained by structure, and structure, once ignored, becomes destiny. This is the quiet weight the tablets leave behind. Not fear, responsibility. A responsibility that does not end with belief, but begins with attention. And attention, once restored, changes how the world is inhabited. Whether humanity is ready for that level of awareness is a question the Sumerians leave unanswered. They end where they began, with observation, with silence, and with the assumption that the system will respond, as it always has, to whatever comes next. Silence, in the Sumerian worldview, is not absence. It is the space where consequences unfold. After instruction fades and oversight withdraws, the tablets grow quieter. Not because nothing happens, but because what happens no longer requires explanation. The patterns repeat often enough to speak for themselves. Civilizations expand into abundance. Confidence hardens into certainty. Certainty blinds perception. This sequence appears again and again, not as prophecy, but as observation. The Sumerians did not describe collapse as sudden. They described it as unnoticed. Pressure accumulates slowly. Adjustments are delayed. Warnings are reinterpreted as anomalies. By the time disruption becomes visible, it is already structural. This is why the final phase before collapse often feels peaceful. Trade continues. Rituals persist. Authority appears stable. Only later, in hindsight, does imbalance become obvious. The tablets seem aware of this paradox. They describe moments when rulers celebrate expansion, while records quietly note depletion. When monuments rise as fields erode. When temples grow ornate as food storage thins. These are not accusations. They are correlations. The world responds not to belief, but to condition. This may be the most unsettling lesson encoded in the texts. The system does not care what humans think it is doing. It responds to what is actually happening. This is why the Sumerians rarely describe moral failure. They describe misalignment. Misalignment between consumption and renewal, between authority and adaptability, between memory and understanding. Once misalignment crosses a threshold, response follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. The absence of drama in this process is striking. Floods arrive without announcement. Droughts persist without explanation. Cities empty quietly. People leave before disaster becomes visible. Archaeology confirms this. Many ancient sites show gradual abandonment rather than violent destruction. Homes left intact, tools set aside, lives relocated. This suggests recognition, an unspoken awareness that conditions have shifted beyond recovery. The Sumerians did not romanticize these moments. They recorded them with restraint, which implies familiarity. They had seen this before, perhaps more than once. This familiarity raises another uncomfortable implication. If humanity has cycled through rise and contraction repeatedly, then collapse is not an exception. It is a phase. And phases are not avoided through denial. They are navigated through awareness. The tablets do not promise salvation. They do not offer escape. They suggest attentiveness. Watch the sky. Observe the land. Measure the rivers. Track the seasons. These are not spiritual practices. They are survival strategies. In this light, the idea of humanity serving something larger becomes clearer. Not serving gods, serving balance, maintaining conditions that allow continuity. Failure to do so does not invite punishment, it invites correction. The system restores equilibrium regardless of intention, which reframes responsibility entirely. Humanity is not judged, it is responded to, and response, unlike judgment, cannot be argued with. This perspective strips away comfort, but it also removes fear. There is no malevolence in the system, only consequence. The Sumerians seem to have accepted this. They did not seek to dominate nature. They sought to understand its tolerances. Modern civilizations, inheriting the structure without the awareness, often reverse this relationship. They assume dominance. They push thresholds without measurement. They interpret stability as permission until response arrives. The tablets end without resolution because resolution implies finality. The Sumerian worldview contains no final state, only cycles, only phases, only adjustment. This is why their record feels unfinished. It was never meant to conclude. It was meant to continue being observed. The unanswered question is not whether humanity was built to serve. It is whether humanity remembers how. And remembrance, once lost, must be relearned through consequence. The system does not explain itself. It responds, quietly, precisely, inevitably. And that response is already in motion, not as threat, not as warning, but as continuation. If there is a final lesson hidden in the Sumerian record, it is not delivered through revelation. It arrives through repetition. The same movements recur across centuries. The same tensions resurface under different names. The same outcomes follow familiar conditions. The tablets do not dramatize this recurrence. They accept it. To the Sumerians, repetition was not failure. It was confirmation. When patterns repeat across generations, they stop being accidents. They become structure. And structure, once recognized, reshapes responsibility. This is why the Sumerians paid such close attention to timing, not dates. Timing. They measured when things happened relative to other things. Floods followed certain celestial alignments. Harvest failures followed specific seasonal deviations. Social unrest followed prolonged imbalance. Cause and effect were observed, not moralized. This observational mindset is what separates the earliest tablets from later mythologies. Later traditions explain disaster through story. The Sumerians documented conditions. They did not ask why the world behaved this way. They asked how often. This shift matters because it suggests a civilization less concerned with justification and more concerned with anticipation. Anticipation is the hallmark of stewardship. It requires humility. It assumes the system exists independently of human desire. This humility is evident in how the Sumerians wrote about themselves. They do not portray humanity as central. They portray it as situated, embedded within cycles larger than culture, larger than politics, larger than memory. The Anunnaki, in this context, function less as overseers and more as placeholders. They represent an earlier stage of understanding, a time when humanity externalized system awareness into figures. As understanding faded, the figures remained. Eventually, the figures became myths. But the system never required belief in them to operate. It required balance. Which brings us to the quiet conclusion the tablets imply but never state. If humanity was built to serve anything, it was not beings from the sky. It was continuity itself. The continuation of life within tolerances that preserve stability. The continuation of systems that allow complexity without collapse. The continuation of balance in a world that does not negotiate. This does not diminish humanity. It contextualizes it. Service, in this sense, is not submission. It is participation. The Sumerians did not see this as limitation. They saw it as responsibility. And responsibility, when ignored, becomes consequence. This is why their texts feel relevant long after their civilization dissolved. The conditions they observed still exist. The thresholds they described still operate. The responses they recorded still unfold. Only the language has changed. We speak now of climate systems, of ecological tipping points, of feedback loops, different terms, same patterns. The planet-sized prison metaphor dissolves entirely here. What remains is a framework, a living system that tolerates variation but resists destabilization. A system that does not punish, it adjusts. And adjustment is indifferent to intention. The Sumerians accepted this. They did not attempt to escape the system. They attempted to live within it. That attempt shaped their architecture, their governance, their myths, their restraint. Whether humanity has retained that restraint is not a question the tablets answer. They leave us instead with recognition. Recognition that the world responds. Recognition that awareness precedes adaptation. Recognition that forgetting invites correction. The final silence of the tablets is not ominous. It is patient. The system does not hurry. It has endured long before humanity wrote its first words. And it will continue long after the last inscription fades. The question is not whether humanity will survive. It is whether it will notice the pattern in time to adapt. The Sumerians noticed. They recorded. They trusted that someone, someday, would read carefully and understand that the most important inheritance was never instruction. It was awareness. Awareness that the world does not belong to us. We belong to it. And belonging, when understood, is not imprisonment. It is alignment. The tablets end here, not because the story is complete, but because observation must continue elsewhere. In the land, in the sky, in the choices that follow. The record passes quietly from clay to memory, from memory to pattern, from pattern to consequence, and the system continues, as it always has. At a certain point, observation becomes inward. The Sumerian record does not point endlessly outward toward gods, skies, or vanished overseers. It slowly turns the attention back toward the observer. This shift is deliberate. Once patterns are recognized, once cycles are understood, once limits are acknowledged, there is nowhere else to look. Only behavior remains. The tablets do not accuse humanity of failure. They do not predict extinction. They do not announce a final judgment. They simply stop speaking, and that silence carries meaning. It suggests that after a certain threshold, no further instruction is possible. Awareness either exists or it does not. From that moment forward, outcomes follow naturally. If balance is respected, continuity holds. If balance is ignored, correction arrives. Not as punishment, not as destiny, but as response. The most unsettling implication of the Sumerian worldview is not that humanity was created to serve. It is that humanity was trusted to observe, trusted to adapt, trusted to restrain itself without supervision. That trust may have been premature, or it may have been inevitable. The tablets never clarify. They leave the question open because the answer changes with every generation. Each civilization inherits the same framework. Each believes it is different. Each tests the same limits. Each learns, eventually, that the system does not bend to belief, only to condition. This is why the ancient scribes wrote as they did, not to warn, not to frighten, not to, but to remember. They preserved a way of seeing the world that did not center humanity as ruler or victim, but as a participant in something vast, ancient, and indifferent to narrative. The world does not need meaning to function. It needs balance. Whether humanity can provide that balance consistently is the only unresolved question that matters, and it is not answered by tablets. It is answered by behavior, by attention, by restraint. The record ends here because the rest is not written. It is lived, quietly, moment by moment, choice by choice. The system waits, not watching, not judging, only responding. And in that response, the story continues, with or without awareness. At some point, a system becomes so familiar that it disappears. Not because it no longer exists, but because it no longer announces itself. The Sumerian tablets seem to anticipate this moment with remarkable clarity. They describe a world where structure precedes awareness, where boundaries exist before anyone remembers who set them. Over time, what was once understood as design becomes indistinguishable from nature itself. This is not accidental. When a framework works long enough, it stops being questioned. Rivers flow where they are expected to flow. Seasons arrive when they are supposed to arrive. Authority exists where it has always existed, and eventually, people stop asking why. This is the moment when systems become invisible. The Sumerians did not see invisibility as progress. They saw it as risk. In their worldview, the most dangerous phase of any civilization is not chaos, but normalization. When limits are accepted without understanding, they lose flexibility. When rules are followed without awareness, they harden. And when structures are mistaken for inevitability, adaptation slows. This is where inherited systems turn from guides into constraints. The tablets hint that early humanity once understood limits as intentional. Boundaries were placed, not discovered. Restrictions existed for reasons that were once known, discussed, and taught. But as generations passed, reasons faded. What remained were forms. Rituals continued long after their original purpose was forgotten. Calendars stayed precise even as the logic behind them dissolved. Sacred spaces remained forbidden without anyone remembering why. Anthropologists often describe this as cultural ossification. The Sumerians seem to describe it as drift. Drift occurs when behavior persists, while understanding decays. And drift, unlike collapse, is comfortable. People thrive during drift. They prosper. They expand. They build monuments. Nothing appears wrong. This is why drift goes unnoticed. The system still functions, just not optimally. Small inefficiencies accumulate. Minor misalignments compound. Feedback is delayed. Eventually, correction arrives. Not suddenly, gradually. Crop yields fluctuate unpredictably. Weather patterns become erratic. Social cohesion strains. At first, these changes are dismissed. Anomalies, exceptions, bad years. The Sumerians record this stage with restraint. They do not dramatize the warning signs. They list them, which suggests familiarity. This is not the first time it has happened. One of the most striking aspects of the Sumerian worldview is its lack of surprise. Events that later cultures would interpret as apocalyptic are treated as expected responses. Floods recur. Droughts repeat. Cities rise and fall. The novelty is not the event. It is the human reaction to it. Those who recognize the pattern adapt. Those who deny it double down. This distinction quietly divides the record. Some rulers are praised not for expansion, but for restraint, for limiting growth, for redistributing resources. for relocating populations before collapse becomes unavoidable. Others vanish from the record abruptly, their cities abandoned, their names erased. The tablets do not moralize this outcome. They simply move on, which implies acceptance. From a systems perspective, this makes sense. A system concerned with long-term balance does not preserve every component. It preserves functionality. This is where modern readers often recoil. We are conditioned to value continuity of identity, of culture, of nation, of civilization. The Sumerian record values continuity of condition. Land remains arable. Water remains accessible. Life continues. Which civilization occupies the space is secondary. This worldview reframes the idea of service one final time. Humanity is not serving rulers. It is serving continuity. The uncomfortable implication is that continuity does not require any particular civilization to survive, only balance. This explains the calm tone of the tablets. There is no panic, no urgency, no plea, only observation. From this perspective, the planet-sized prison metaphor loses its emotional charge. A prison implies injustice. A system implies indifference. The Sumerians describe a world that does not care who inhabits it, only how it is inhabited. This indifference is often mistaken for hostility, but hostility implies intent. The system has none. It responds to conditions, and response is impartial. The more humanity mistook structure for nature, the less capable it became of recognizing correction when it arrived. Later, cultures replaced observation with belief. Belief is comforting. It explains suffering. It assigns blame. But belief does not alter conditions. The Sumerians seem to understand this distinction. They did not pray for floods to stop. They built for them. They did not deny drought. They relocated. They did not interpret collapse as divine abandonment. They interpreted it as misalignment. This pragmatic response suggests a civilization less interested in meaning than in survival. Which brings us to the most subtle insight embedded in the tablets. If humanity was built or shaped to serve continuity, then awareness is the primary tool of that service. Awareness of cycles, awareness of limits, awareness of consequence. Once awareness fades, service becomes accidental. An accidental service eventually becomes exploitation. Humans extract without understanding renewal. They expand without measuring capacity. They govern without adaptability. The system responds, not to punish, but to correct. This is not a future prediction. It is a historical pattern. The Sumerians do not warn that catastrophe will come. They demonstrate that it has come many times under similar conditions. Their restraint in language suggests resignation, or perhaps confidence. Confidence that the system will endure regardless of human memory. Which raises a final, quietly unsettling question. If the system does not require humanity to understand it, then who does the understanding serve? The answer is not the system. It functions either way. Understanding serves humanity. It allows adaptation before correction becomes severe. It allows restraint before limits are breached. It allows continuity without collapse. This may be why the tablets were written at all, not as commands, not as warnings, but as reminders. Fragments of awareness preserved in clay, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to read carefully, not to fear the past, but to recognize the pattern. And recognition, once achieved, cannot be undone. It changes how growth is perceived, how power is exercised, how limits are interpreted. The Sumerians do not promise that awareness will save civilization. They suggest it may soften correction. And in a system that does not negotiate, that may be the only mercy available. This is where the expansion must pause. Not because the subject is exhausted, but because the implication has widened enough to absorb the ending that follows. The final section must narrow again, quietly, carefully, without reopening what has already been seen. Once the system is recognized, the question changes. It is no longer who built it, nor even why it exists. Those questions belong to curiosity. The deeper question belongs to responsibility. If the world operates according to limits that predate memory, and if those limits persist regardless of belief, then humanity's role is no longer theoretical, it is practical. The Sumerian tablets do not ask whether humans should live within balance. They assume it. What they explore, quietly, persistently, is what happens when humans forget that balance was ever intentional. This forgetting is not sudden. It unfolds slowly, across generations. The first generation remembers instruction. The second remembers tradition. The third remembers only habit. By the fourth, habit becomes identity. At that point, questioning the system feels unnatural. This is where systems become self-defending. Limits are no longer seen as stabilizing. They are seen as obstacles. Restraint becomes weakness. Adaptation becomes betrayal. And expansion becomes virtue. The tablets hint that this stage is the most dangerous. Not because it is violent, but because it is confident. Civilizations at this phase feel permanent. They build not for survival, but for legacy. They invest in symbols rather than systems. They assume the future will resemble the present. This assumption has consequences. The Sumerians do not frame these consequences as punishment. They frame them as exposure. When expansion exceeds renewal, shortages appear. When authority rigidifies, fragmentation follows. When adaptation slows, shocks intensify. Each response reveals a limit that was always there. Only now it is felt. This is why collapse in the Sumerian record is never described as surprise. It is described as recognition. People do not wake one day to find the world broken. They realize, gradually, that it has been strained beyond tolerance. Archaeological layers support this. Collapse is rarely instantaneous. It unfolds through migration, decentralization, abandonment. People leave before systems fail completely. This suggests awareness. Not complete understanding, but enough to respond. Those who recognize the pattern early survive. Those who insist on permanence do not. The tablets do not celebrate survival. They document it. This documentation strips collapse of drama. What remains is process. The planet-sized prison metaphor, at this stage, transforms again. If the world were a prison, escape would be the goal. But the Sumerians never sought escape. They sought alignment. This distinction is essential. Prisons are resisted. Systems are navigated. The Sumerian worldview is navigational. It accepts limits. It works within them, and it adjusts when conditions change. This worldview does not deny ambition. It contextualizes it. Ambition is acceptable when it preserves balance. It becomes destructive when it ignores it. This framing avoids moral absolutism. No action is inherently evil, only misaligned. This is why the tablets rarely condemn individuals. They focus on conditions. Kings fall not because they are wicked, but because they fail to adapt. Cities vanish not because they are sinful, but because they overextend. The system does not judge intent. It responds to outcome. This response is often misread as cruelty, but cruelty implies choice. The system does not choose. It compensates. Understanding this shifts the emotional weight of the entire record. Fear dissolves. What remains is accountability. Humanity is not trapped. It is situated. Situated within constraints that allow life to flourish, if respected. The most sobering implication of the Sumerian worldview is that freedom is conditional, not politically, ecologically, structurally. Freedom exists only within tolerances. Beyond them, correction replaces choice. This is not pessimism. It is realism. The tablets do not claim this reality can be transcended. They suggest it can be understood. And understanding changes behavior. This is why the record narrows at the end. It does not spiral into speculation. It turns inward, toward the listener, toward the observer, toward the participant. The final implication is not about ancient beings. It is about inherited responsibility. If humanity was built to serve anything, it was never God's. It was balance. And balance does not require worship. It requires awareness. That awareness cannot be inherited automatically. It must be renewed. Again, and again, and again. The Sumerians wrote not because they expected to be remembered. They wrote because forgetting was inevitable. And in that inevitability, they trusted that fragments would survive. Enough to spark recognition. Enough to slow expansion. Enough to soften correction. Whether that trust was justified is not something the tablets resolve. They leave that answer to the future, which is where the record now rests, quietly, waiting. At the very end of the Sumerian record, there is no warning, no final instruction, no closing command, no declaration of failure or success. There is only quiet continuity. This absence is deliberate. The scribes who pressed symbols into clay understood something that later civilizations struggled to accept, that no system survives through explanation alone. At some point, explanation gives way to experience. Understanding becomes behavioral, not textual. The tablets do not attempt to carry humanity across that threshold. They stop just before it. This is not abandonment. It is restraint. To say more would have been to interfere. And interference, in the Sumerian worldview, belongs to the overseers, not to memory. What they leave behind is not doctrine. It is orientation. A way of seeing the world that does not require belief to function. Only attention. Attention to limits that do not announce themselves. Attention to cycles that continue regardless of intention. Attention to the difference between growth and strain. The Sumerians did not imagine humanity as doomed. They imagined it as forgetful. Forgetfulness, in their view, was not a moral flaw. It was a natural consequence of inheritance. Each generation receives a world already shaped, already functioning, already constrained. And because the system works most of the time, it is assumed to be infinite. This assumption is never stated. It is lived. Only later, when conditions shift beyond tolerance, does the assumption become visible. By then, response is already underway. The Sumerians seem to have accepted this inevitability. They did not believe memory could permanently prevent correction. They believed it could soften it. This is why their writing is neither urgent nor alarmist. Urgency implies control. They did not believe control was possible. Only alignment. Alignment requires humility. It requires recognition that the world does not belong to its inhabitants. It belongs to continuity. And continuity does not negotiate with identity. Civilizations rise believing they are unique. They fall discovering they are familiar. The tablets do not frame this as tragedy. They frame it as rhythm. A rhythm that predates humanity and will outlast it. If there were once overseers, whether literal symbolic, or misunderstood. Their greatest intervention may not have been creation. It may have been withdrawal, a deliberate absence that forced humanity to confront consequence without mediation. In this sense, the planet-sized prison is not a cage. It is a test, not of obedience, but of awareness. Can a species regulate itself without instruction? Can it recognize limits without enforcement? Can it sustain balance without oversight? The Sumerians do not answer these questions. They refuse to. Answers would freeze the pattern. They leave instead a record of observation, a mirror rather than a map. The responsibility passes quietly from clay to consciousness, from inscription to behavior, from memory to choice. Whether humanity was built to serve is, in the end, the wrong question. Service implies hierarchy. What the tablets describe is participation. Participation in systems that do not privilege intention over outcome. Participation in cycles that respond to condition rather than belief. Participation in a world that remains indifferent to narrative, but sensitive to imbalance. This is not a pessimistic vision. It is a grounded one. It does not deny possibility. It defines context. Within that context, humanity is neither prisoner nor master. It is caretaker, only when it remembers how. The Sumerian record ends without ceremony because ceremony implies closure. There is none. The system continues, quietly, patiently, responding not to fear or hope, but to action. The final inheritance is not knowledge. It is responsibility. And responsibility, once recognized, does not require instruction, only attention. The clay dries. The symbols fade, but the pattern remains, waiting. One of the strangest ideas hidden in the Sumerian worldview is that memory itself can destabilize a system. Not forgetting, remembering. The tablets never suggest that all knowledge should be preserved. They suggest the opposite. Certain knowledge appears only briefly, then vanishes. Not erased violently, not destroyed, simply allowed to fade. This is deeply counterintuitive to modern thinking. We assume preservation equals progress, that more memory means more control, that storing information safeguards civilization. The Sumerians were not convinced. They observed something unsettling. Knowledge, when carried into the wrong conditions, amplifies imbalance. Tools designed for restraint become instruments of excess. Systems meant to regulate become mechanisms of exploitation. Insights meant to stabilize become accelerants of collapse. This is why the most technical Sumerian texts are also the most fragile. Many survive only in fragments. This absence is often blamed on time. But the pattern of disappearance is selective. Administrative tablets endure. Mythic narratives persist. Practical measurements recur. But certain procedural descriptions vanish almost entirely, especially those related to thresholds, limits, mechanisms of correction. It is as if some information was not meant to survive intact. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was dangerous without context. Context, in the Sumerian worldview, is everything. Knowledge divorced from environmental awareness becomes destabilizing. A flood barrier built without understanding river cycles fails catastrophically. An agricultural expansion pursued without seasonal restraint exhausts land. A centralized authority, maintained beyond adaptability, fractures society. These failures are not moral. They are mechanical. The tablets do not condemn those who misuse knowledge. They record outcomes, which suggests that the Sumerians understood something modern. Civilizations still resist. Not all information is universally beneficial. Some knowledge must be re-earned. re-earned through observation, through adaptation, through humility. This explains why later cultures often rediscover principles rather than inherit them. Why irrigation techniques collapse and are reinvented. Why architectural wisdom is lost and relearned. Why governance oscillates between centralization and fragmentation. The system does not preserve optimal configurations indefinitely. It allows experimentation, and then it corrects. The danger of inherited knowledge is that it bypasses learning. It creates confidence without understanding, which is why the Sumerians appear cautious about transmission. They encode critical insights in story rather than instruction. Story requires interpretation. Interpretation requires engagement. Engagement rebuilds context. This may be why myths endure longer than manuals. Manuals assume stable conditions. Myths adapt. Seen this way, the Anunnaki narratives take on new meaning. They are not records of beings. They are memory scaffolds, frameworks that carry systemic awareness across generations without requiring technical precision. When the framework becomes literalized, meaning distorts. When gods become beings rather than symbols, responsibility shifts outward. Humans obey instead of observe, and observation weakens. The tablets hint that this shift precedes collapse. When humans stop watching the world and start watching authority, misalignment grows. Authority becomes static. The environment remains dynamic. Correction follows. This pattern is visible across history. Civilizations that codify belief more rigidly than observation stagnate. They mistake stability for permanence. They resist feedback, and resistance magnifies correction. The Sumerians seem to have anticipated this failure mode. They did not attempt to solve it. They accepted it. Because the system does not reward perfect memory. It rewards responsiveness. Responsiveness cannot be inherited. It must be practiced. This is why the idea of a planet-sized prison remains misleading. A prison restricts movement. The Sumerian world restricts assumption. It limits how far imbalance can propagate before response intervenes. Within those limits, variation is immense. Cultures rise differently. Beliefs diversify. Technologies evolve. But thresholds remain. The same pressures produce the same outcomes. This consistency is not oppression. It is structure. The real danger, according to the tablets, is not limitation. It is misinterpretation. When humans interpret limits as injustice rather than feedback, they push harder. When they interpret correction as punishment rather than adjustment, they resist adaptation. This resistance does not change the outcome. It intensifies it. The Sumerians did not write to prevent collapse. They wrote to contextualize it, to show that collapse is not the end of the world. It is the system preserving itself. What is lost is not humanity. It is configuration. Configurations change. Life continues. This perspective removes both panic and despair, but it also removes entitlement. Humanity is not guaranteed dominance, only participation. Participation requires awareness, and awareness, once lost, must be relearned the hard way. The tablets seem to acknowledge this with quiet resignation. They do not assume their warnings will be heeded. They assume they will be rediscovered. Perhaps too late. Perhaps just in time. They leave that uncertainty unresolved, because uncertainty is part of the system, and systems, unlike stories, do not resolve cleanly. They adjust, again and again. Collapse is almost always described as an event: a flood, a famine, an invasion, a year when everything ended. The Sumerian record does not support this framing. It treats collapse as a revelation, not a rupture. something that was already unfolding becomes impossible to ignore. This distinction matters because when collapse is treated as sudden, it feels random. And when it feels random, it feels unjust. And when it feels unjust, humans search for blame instead of pattern. The tablets quietly undermine this instinct. They show that collapse is not an interruption of normal life. It is normal life, once certain thresholds are crossed. Long before cities empty, signals appear. Long before famine, soil chemistry shifts. Long before migration, trade routes strain. Long before unrest, authority hardens. None of these signals are dramatic. That is why they are ignored. Human attention is drawn to spectacle, not drift. The Sumerians understood this weakness. They did not dramatize early warning signs because drama would have distorted them. Instead, they recorded monotony. Year after year of slightly reduced yields. Season after season of marginal deviation. Generation after generation of incremental strain. Individually, these changes mean nothing. Collectively, they guarantee response. This is why collapse feels sudden. Because the human mind does not track slow accumulation well. By the time thresholds are crossed, the visible event appears abrupt. But the system has been adjusting for decades, sometimes centuries. Archaeology confirms this. So-called sudden collapses are preceded by long periods of quiet stress. The evidence is subtle. Smaller dwellings, reduced dietary diversity, increased fortification, more rigid governance, less innovation, more repetition. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of tightening tolerance, the system narrowing options. The Sumerians did not fear this narrowing. They expected it. Their writings suggest that flexibility decreases as imbalance increases. Options close. Margins shrink. At some point, only drastic adjustment remains. This is not cruelty. It is physics. When a structure exceeds capacity, redistribution occurs. Pressure moves. Weak points give way. Stability returns in a new configuration. This is why collapse often reorganizes rather than annihilates. Cities fall, but rural populations survive. States dissolve, but cultural practices persist. Technologies regress, but knowledge fragments remain. The Sumerians understood that collapse selects for adaptability. Those who recognize drift early migrate. Those who cling to permanence remain and suffer the full correction. This is why later myths portray collapse as punishment. Punishment implies choice, but the tablets imply exposure. Exposure of misalignment that was already present. This reframing removes moral panic, but it also removes comfort, because it suggests that good intentions do not prevent collapse. Only alignment does. This may be the most difficult lesson to accept. Human cultures invest heavily in intent. They value belief, purpose, righteousness. The system does not. It responds to condition. This is why civilizations with noble ideals still collapse. Ideals do not regulate resource flow. They do not stabilize ecosystems. They do not enforce adaptation. Only behavior does. The Sumerians appear to have understood this. They did not record their values as guarantees. They recorded their practices, what people ate, where they lived, how they redistributed stress. Values mattered only insofar as they shaped behavior. This pragmatic orientation is what gives the tablets their unsettling clarity. They refuse to flatter humanity. They do not center human meaning. They center systemic response, which returns us again to the idea of service. If humanity was built or shaped to serve, it was never meant to serve ideals. It was meant to serve equilibrium. And equilibrium is blind to intention. This does not make the system hostile. It makes it impartial. The Sumerians seem to have accepted this impartiality. They did not argue with floods. They adjusted settlements. They did not moralize drought. They changed crops. They did not resist migration. They followed it. This adaptability prolonged continuity, not indefinitely, but long enough. Modern narratives often treat collapse as failure. The Sumerian record treats it as transition, a transition that punishes rigidity and rewards responsiveness. This is why collapse feels sudden only to those who resist change. To those who adapt early, it feels inevitable but survivable. The tablets do not promise that adaptation prevents loss. They suggest it prevents annihilation. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Civilization may end. Life continues. Which means the system's priority is not culture. It is continuity. This realization can feel dehumanizing, but the Sumerians did not experience it that way. They did not see themselves as expendable. They saw themselves as participants in something larger than identity, a system that did not revolve around them, but sustained them conditionally. This conditionality is the quiet thread running through every tablet. Nothing is guaranteed. Nothing is exempt. Everything responds. Once this is understood, collapse loses its terror. It becomes feedback, harsh feedback, but intelligible. The tragedy, according to the tablets, is not collapse itself. It is the refusal to recognize drift while there is still time to adapt. That refusal is always human. The system never refuses. It simply responds. And it will continue to respond, whether noticed or not. Near the end of the Sumerian record, something changes. Not in tone, not in language, but in density. Earlier tablets are meticulous. Numbers, measures, lists, cycles, names. Later ones grow sparse. Not because knowledge vanished, but because explanation stopped being necessary. This is easy to misunderstand. Many modern readers interpret the thinning record as decline, as loss of literacy, as cultural decay. But the internal structure suggests something else. The tablets are not less informed. They are less concerned with persuasion. Earlier texts explain the world. Later ones assume it is already understood. This shift is subtle, but decisive. It suggests that the people writing these tablets no longer believed explanation could alter outcomes. Not out of despair, out of acceptance. The world, as they understood it, had already revealed its nature. Patterns had repeated enough times. Cycles had closed often enough. There was no longer urgency in warning, only continuity in recording. This is not resignation. It is alignment. The Sumerians appear to reach a point where they stop asking why collapse occurs. They focus instead on how life continues afterward. This is where the interpretation of service quietly resolves. Not service to gods, not service to rulers, not even service to some external intelligence, but service to process, to continuation, to the unbroken thread of adaptation. The idea that humanity was built to serve sounds ominous only if service is framed as submission. The tablets do not frame it that way. They frame it as participation. Humanity as a carrier, not a controller. A carrier of knowledge, practice, memory, adjustment. When one configuration fails, the carrier moves on. Not every individual survives, but the pattern does. This is not comforting, but it is clarifying. It means collapse is not the end of the human role. It is the mechanism by which the role continues. This is why the tablets never glorify permanence. They glorify transmission. Seeds carried to new ground. Stories retold in altered forms. Techniques simplified. then rediscovered, the same river, entering new channels. From this perspective, the planet-sized prison interpretation collapses under its own weight. A prison restricts movement. The Sumerian worldview assumes movement is inevitable. Cities rise where conditions allow. They dissolve where conditions change. People move. Practices follow. Memory adapts. If there is confinement, it is not physical. It is cognitive. The confinement is the belief that the current configuration is final. That belief appears nowhere in the tablets. They never assume that this city is the last city, that this way of living is the end of history, that this order will endure. They assume the opposite, which may be why their record feels unsettling to modern readers. Modern civilization is built on the assumption of extension, more growth, more accumulation, more permanence. The Sumerian record assumes contraction is inevitable and survivable. This difference matters because it reframes collapse not as failure, but as handoff. A relay, not a verdict. This also reframes the role of memory. The tablets were never meant to prevent collapse. They were meant to prepare for it. Not emotionally, practically. They preserved patterns so that future societies, whether directly descended or rediscovered, could recognize familiar signals, so that someone, somewhere, might notice. This has happened before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. And because it has happened before, it can be navigated again. This is the quiet gift embedded in the record. Not prophecy, not warning, not instruction. Recognition. The recognition that human history does not move forward in a straight line. It oscillates, compresses, expands, and within those movements, something persists. Not empires, not gods, not monuments, but responsiveness. The capacity to adjust, to shed excess, to reconfigure, to carry forward only what still works. If humanity was built to serve anything, the tablets suggest it was built to serve continuity under change. Not progress, not dominance, not transcendence. Continuity. This interpretation strips away both fear and fantasy. There is no hidden jailer, no cosmic overlord managing collapse, no final reckoning encoded in stone. There is only a system that responds consistently, and a species that sometimes listens. The unsettling part is not that collapse occurs. It is that collapse is normal. The comforting part is that survival is too, just not in the forms we prefer. The tablets end without drama. No apocalypse, no revelation, no final sentence explaining everything. They simply stop, which may be the most honest ending possible. Not because the story is finished, but because it never was a story. It was a record, and records do not conclude. They are interrupted, picked up again, translated differently, understood partially, then carried forward. You are part of that process now, not as a subject, not as a servant, but as a witness to continuity. The Sumerians did not ask who would read their words. They assumed someone would, because someone always does. When conditions change enough, memory resurfaces, not to warn, but to remind. And that reminder is simple. The sky has changed before. Civilizations have reorganized before. Humanity has adapted before. Not because it was guided, but because it learned. Slowly, imperfectly, again and again. That may be the only role that has ever been required, and it may still be enough.